Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, walls aligned to the sun, 800 years of silence in a canyon that should never have been built in at all. The textbooks say a civilization rose here, then, around the year 1200, it vanished into the desert. But this is not the only place we were told that. It was said of a city on the Mississippi, larger at its peak than London. Of a people who cut hundreds of miles of canal across a desert with stone tools, whose own name was turned into the words, "those who are gone." Of builders who raised monuments before the pyramids of Egypt. Every time, the same word, vanished. And every time, it was wrong. In the last 10 years, ancient DNA and the descendants themselves have taken that word apart. Not one of these civilizations disappeared. Their descendants are alive right now, farming the same ground. Which leaves a harder question than any mystery. If nobody vanished, who wrote the ending, and what was it for? It begins in a canyon in New Mexico, with 14 bodies in a sealed room. To understand what the science overturned, you first have to stand in the place it overturned, and that means looking hard at a canyon that makes no sense. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by almost nothing. No river of any consequence, no fertile valley. No obvious reason, looking at it today, why anyone would choose to build there at all. And yet, between roughly the years 900 and 1150, this empty seam of stone became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that reached across some 90,000 square miles. That is an area larger than the whole of Ireland. Run from a canyon, you could walk end to end in an afternoon. They built great houses, more than 150 of them. Massive stone structures rising as high as 5 stories, some holding more than 600 rooms, raised to a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to match. The walls were engineered with rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer, fitted so cleanly that the joints still hold today. This was not the work of people improvising shelter against the weather. This was design, and the design reached for the sky. The rooms and the walls were laid out to track the movements of the sun and the moon across cycles that take decades to complete. High on Fajada Butte, a spiral carved into the rock catches a thin blade of light that falls through 2 slabs of stone and marks the summer solstice to within a matter of minutes. It marks the equinoxes too, and the far swing of the moon that returns only once in about 19 years. Think about what that requires. Someone stood in that desert and watched the heavens, not for a season, but across a working lifetime, long enough to catch a rhythm that most people never live to see repeat. And then they built it into the stone. Then they connected it all. A network of roads ran out from the canyon, some of them 30 feet wide, cut in lines so straight they seemed drawn with a ruler across hundreds of miles of broken country. These were not trade routes in any ordinary sense. They climbed cliffs instead of going around them. They ran dead straight where a sensible path would have curved. They were built to say something about the people who made them, not simply to move goods from one place to another. And at the heart of every great house sat the kivas, circular, sunken, ceremonial chambers built down into the earth, some small enough for a handful of people, some large enough to hold hundreds at once. These were the gathering places, the rooms where whatever bound this civilization together was renewed, generation after generation, for the better part of 300 years. By every measure we have, Chaco was extraordinary. The planning, the engineering, the astronomy fixed into the architecture, the sheer scale of coordinated labor it would take to quarry the stone, raise the walls, and cut those roads across that distance. This was not a loose scattering of farming villages. This was something organized, something with a mind behind it. And then, around the year 1200, it ended. Not gradually. The great houses were abandoned within a few generations. The roads fell silent. The population that had built one of the most ambitious construction projects in the history of ancient North America simply walked away and left it all standing. Perfect masonry, 5-story walls, ceremonial chambers still holding their objects. Empty, For a long time, this was treated as one of the great mysteries of American archaeology. The buildings were too good, too deliberate, too carefully aligned to have been abandoned on a whim. So the questions hung in the dry air. What had happened here? Where had everyone gone? And the answer that settled into the textbooks across the 20th century was a reassuring one. It was tidy. A civilization rose. A civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. For most of 100 years, that was the story told in museums, printed on placards, repeated in documentaries, and taught to school children as settled fact. There was only one problem with it. Almost every part of that story had been written before anyone could read the one piece of evidence that mattered most. For most of the last century, the picture of these people was a comfortable one. They were peaceful farmers, egalitarian, democratic, a people who worshipped the sun and the corn and the turning of the seasons, who lived in balance with the land and with each other, and who, for reasons no one could quite name, eventually scattered into the wider desert and faded out of history. They were given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi, a word now understood to carry uncomfortable meanings, which is why many archaeologists today prefer the term ancestral Puebloan. But for most of the 20th century, Anasazi was the name fixed to the mystery, and the mystery had a tidy shape. It is worth being fair to the people who built that picture, because they were not careless. They studied the shape of a corn grinding stone. They read the style of a painted vessel. They measured the walls and mapped the roads. They did the best work the evidence allowed. But the most important evidence of all was one they could not yet touch. The bodies themselves, buried beneath the floors of the great houses, held a record no pottery could give. And the tools to read that record did not exist. So the peaceful farmer story was written in good faith, in the absence of the one witness who could contradict it. Then the tools arrived. In the 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that let researchers pull readable genetic material from Chacoan bones that had been sitting in museum drawers since the 1890s. The first of these skeletons came from a place inside Pueblo Bonito known as Room 33, a small walled crypt at the heart of the grandest great house in the canyon, holding the remains of 14 people surrounded by extraordinary wealth, reed mats, conch shell trumpets carried from the Pacific coast, turquoise by the thousands of pieces. A team led by the archaeologist Douglas Kennett, working with Stephen Plogg and their colleagues, published what they found in the year 2017. And it did not fit the peaceful, leaderless story at all. 9 of the individuals in that crypt shared the exact same mitochondrial genome. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, so an identical signature meant these were not strangers laid together by chance. They were one family, joined through the female line. And the nuclear DNA went further. It identified a mother and a daughter buried in the same room, and a grandmother and grandson separated in death but bound by blood. These people had not been gathered here over a single hard winter. The dates stretched across roughly 330 years. For more than 3 centuries, one lineage had held the most sacred ground in the canyon and passed it down through its mothers. This was not a community of equals. This was a dynasty. The textbooks had described a people without rulers. The DNA described a ruling house. It is important to be honest about the limits, because good science states them plainly. Only 9 of the 14 bodies yielded usable DNA. Some researchers have cautioned that 9 individuals from a single room cannot, on their own, speak for the social order of a civilization that spanned 90,000 square miles. They are right to say so. But the finding does something the old story cannot survive. It puts inherited power, held by one family across 10 generations, at the very center of a society that had been called egalitarian for 100 years. And once that pillar fell, the whole structure was open to question. The wealth in that crypt had to come from somewhere. The turquoise, the shells from a distant ocean, the trumpets. A small farming village does not gather treasure like that by accident. It gathers it through reach, through trade lines running far beyond the desert. And when researchers followed where those treasures had come from, the trail did not lead deeper into the southwest. It led south more than 1,000 miles toward the great civilizations of central Mexico. And the direction it came from matters for everything that follows. Start with the things you can hold. Among the goods that begin appearing at Chaco during its golden age are the feathers and the bones of scarlet macaws, tropical birds that live only in the lowland forests far to the south. Some of them, when the science dated them, turned out to have reached the canyon strikingly early, generations before Chaco reached its peak, which means the line running south was open long before anyone thought. There are copper bells, cast in the metallurgical tradition of Mexico, a craft that had no roots anywhere in the southwest. And there is chocolate, biochemical analysis of the residue inside tall cylinder vessels from Pueblo Bonito turned up traces of cacao, harvested from a plant that grows more than 1,000 miles away in the tropics. People in this dry northern canyon were drinking a beverage prepared from a crop they could not possibly have grown. Someone was carrying it to them. Then there is the architecture, and here the influence becomes harder to wave away. Inside Chaco Canyon, at the great house called Chetro Kettle, a row of stone columns was raised along a ceremonial wall, a colonnade of the kind that fronts the temples of Mexico, hundreds of miles to the south. No one else in the surrounding desert was building anything like it. And at some later point, someone filled the spaces between those columns in, as though the signature had become something to hide. But the original construction is unmistakable, and it points in the same direction as the birds and the bells and the chocolate. Now, it is tempting to read all of this as a single dramatic event, an invasion, a foreign elite arriving to seize the canyon and rule it, and some writers have argued for exactly that. But it is important to be careful here, because the evidence supports a quieter and more honest claim. What the macaws and the copper and the cacao establish beyond reasonable doubt is sustained long-distance contact. The flow of prestige goods, of ideas, of architectural knowledge, and very possibly of a few individuals across an enormous span of country. What it does not prove, on the genetics we actually have, is a foreign dynasty replacing the bloodline of the canyon. The DNA from Chaco points to deep local continuity, not a southern takeover. The stronger version of the story, the one where Mexico conquers the Southwest, is interpretation, and it remains contested. But contact alone is enough to change the picture, because ideas travel along trade routes just as surely as feathers and bells do. And the world those goods came from was not only a world of astronomers and architects and metalworkers. It was a world with a particular way of understanding the universe, a worldview in which order had to be maintained through ritual, and ritual sometimes demanded the most extreme offering a community can make. And alongside the treasures, the canyon left behind something else, something one man spent 30 years refusing to look away from. His name was Christy Turner. He was a physical anthropologist, trained in forensic work, and he knew the difference between bones that had been laid to rest and bones that had been treated as something else. When Turner examined skeletal collections from Chaco and its surrounding great houses, he saw a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer story at all. The bones had not been buried. They had been processed, dismembered, broken open, burned, and scattered. And the damage on them matched, with disturbing precision, the damage found on the bones of animals that had been butchered for food. So Turner built a test. He assembled a forensic checklist of criteria that all had to be present before he would draw any conclusion, burning on the backs of skulls, but not the faces, the mark of a head set on a fire. Anvil abrasion, the scraping left when a bone is smashed between two stones to reach the marrow inside. Cut marks from stone tools at the joints where tendon meets bone. Pot polish, a faint sheen left on fragments stirred against the inside of a ceramic vessel. Fracture patterns that only appear when fresh bone is broken rather than old, dry bone. And most damning of all, the systematic absence of the vertebrae, the richest source of marrow in the body, pulverized and gone. Applied across dozens of Chacoan sites, the checklist returned close to 300 individuals who met the full set of criteria. Men, women, and children, processed in the same way these people processed deer and rabbit. For 20 years, critics held a single line against him: butchering is not eating. A body could be cut apart for any number of reasons: in war, in fear, in some rite we do not understand, without the flesh ever being consumed. The distinction mattered, and it refused to close. Then it closed at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. There, a team of researchers found the remains of 7 people processed to every one of the criteria on Turner's list. And in a hearth at the center of the site, alongside the cooking vessels, they found a coprolite, preserved human waste left behind at the scene. One of the researchers, Richard Mahler, designed a test for a single protein, human myoglobin, which is found only in human muscle tissue and is present nowhere in the gut of a person who has eaten only plants or ordinary game. The test came back positive in the coprolite and on a cooking pot, while control samples from comparable sites came back clean. The conclusion, published in the journal Nature in the year 2000, was as direct as the science allowed. Someone at Cowboy Wash had eaten human flesh. Here the story has to be told carefully and honestly. The Pueblo descendant communities, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblos, have contested this interpretation for decades, and their objection deserves real weight, not a footnote. They have pointed out, correctly, that accusations of cannibalism have been used throughout American history to dehumanize Native peoples. They have argued that forensic evidence can record that an event happened, but cannot recover what it meant. And they have insisted that whatever took place in those rooms was done to their ancestors, not by a people to be defined by it. That distinction sits at the center of the question, because the larger explanation that has grown up around these bones, the idea of an imported religion of terror administered by a foreign priesthood, is interpretation. It is one reading, and it remains disputed. The genetics do not confirm it. What the bones confirm is narrower, and it is enough. What they confirm is this: the signature is not scattered at random across the map. It is concentrated. It clusters in and around the great houses, the ceremonial heart of the Chacoan world, and it tracks the canyon's own lifespan with unsettling closeness. The pattern rises as Chaco rises. It holds through the centuries of the great houses, and it begins to fade almost exactly when Chaco itself begins to fall. Whatever this was, it belonged to Chaco, and it ended when Chaco ended. Which raises the question everything has been building toward: what ended Chaco? The end did not arrive from a single direction. It came from several at once, and the first of them was written in the rings of trees. Across the 4 corners, the wood that has survived from this period carries a year-by-year record of rainfall, laid down ring by ring for more than 1,000 years. Read carefully. It shows that the warmer, wetter trend that had sustained Chacoan farming for the better part of 3 centuries broke in the middle of the 12th century. Between roughly the years 1130 and 1180, the Southwest entered a long drought. The winters turned colder, the summers turned drier, and the rainfall that had let Chacoan farmers grow maize at altitudes and in soils that should never have supported it began to fail, season after season, in a pattern that lasted long enough to break the foundation of everything built on top of it. Chaco had always been vulnerable to exactly this. The canyon itself had no reliable water. The great houses, the roads, the ceremonial centers had never fed themselves. They were sustained by an immense coordinated effort to move food and materials inward, from the outlying regions to the ritual core. It was a system that worked only as long as the edges produced a surplus, and when the edges could no longer grow enough to feed even themselves, the tribute stopped flowing. The coordination that had held 90,000 square miles together began to come apart. Then the great houses were abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, not sacked by an enemy, abandoned. The people walked out and left their homes standing, the walls intact, the rooms still holding their objects as though they expected the wind to keep them. And the emptying followed a clear and traceable line, By the year 1200, the depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By 1250, the outlying communities were draining as well. By 1300, the Four Corners region, which had supported one of the most densely organized societies anywhere in ancient North America, was effectively empty of permanent settlement. The kivas that had once held hundreds fell silent. The roads that had run dead straight across the desert were reclaimed by it. The great houses, raised with such obsessive precision, were left to the sun. This is the exact moment the textbook narrative settles on: the vanishing, the mystery, the lost civilization, the empty buildings, the unanswered question hanging over the ruins of where everyone had gone. For a century and a half, this was treated as the end of the story. And this is precisely where that story has always been wrong, because abandonment is not the same as disappearance. A people who leave a place have not ceased to exist. They have gone somewhere. The question was never whether the Chacoans survived the collapse of their system. Many of them did. The question, the one that took the better part of a century to even ask properly, was simpler and stranger than the mystery ever allowed. Where did they go? They went south and east. They followed the water. The depopulation of Chaco was not a vanishing, it was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system, who had endured whatever happened in those great houses across 2.5 centuries, did not walk into the desert and dissolve. They walked toward the rivers that still ran, to the Rio Grande, to the Little Colorado, to the mesas where farming was still possible in a drying world. They carried with them everything that had let their ancestors survive in the first place. The knowledge of how to grow maize in hard country, the reading of the sky, the masonry. And they left behind the ceremonial centers of a system that had, for whatever reason, stopped being worth carrying. For more than 600 years, the record of where they went was held in one place and one place only: the oral traditions of their descendants, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Rio Grande Pueblos, all of whom had said consistently and for generations that the people of the great houses were their own ancestors, that no one had ever truly disappeared. And for most of those 6 centuries, the academic world declined to treat those traditions as evidence. They were stories, it was decided. Memory, not history. Then the genetics caught up to what the descendants had been saying all along. In the year 2025, a study published in the journal Nature did something the field had never quite managed before. It was led by researchers working in full partnership with Picuris Pueblo, a community in northern New Mexico, on a project the tribe itself had initiated and controlled. The team compared the DNA of living Picuris people with ancient DNA from individuals buried in their own territory across the last several centuries. And the result was a clear, unbroken line of genetic continuity, reaching back from the present day and connecting more broadly to the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon. There was no population collapse before the Europeans arrived. No replacement. No erasure, just continuity, written in the body, exactly where the oral traditions had always placed it. This is the finding that turns the whole story over. The Hopi and the Zuni and the Acoma and the people of the Rio Grande Pueblos are not the distant heirs of a lost civilization. They are not what came after the Anasazi. They are the Anasazi, farming the country their ancestors farmed, carrying in their cells the biological record of the people who raised the great houses and cut the roads and aligned the walls to the sun. The oral histories had been accurate for 800 years. They had told the story correctly the entire time. Ancient DNA did not rediscover these people. It confirmed something that had never actually been forgotten, except by the outsiders who came later and decided the story needed an ending. So hold on to what the canyon actually taught us, because we are going to need it again and again. The people were not a riddle that vanished into the desert air. They were human beings with the same minds we carry now, who built something extraordinary in an impossible place, lived under a system we are still struggling to understand, and then, when that system failed them, did the most human thing imaginable. They left. They survived. They went looking for water and they found it. And they carried their world with them to higher ground. The buildings stayed behind, the people did not. But if Chaco's people did not vanish, if they chose deliberately to walk away from homes this good, that raises a colder question than the one we started with. What does it take to make an entire people abandon everything they have built all at once and leave in a hurry? Because the leaving was not always calm, and it was not always slow. To see the other face of it, you do not look at the capital they left behind. You look at the cliffs they climbed into on the way out, and you look at what was done to the ones who did not make it out at all. So look at the cliffs. For centuries, the families here lived up on top, out in the open, on the flat green mesas of what is now southwestern Colorado, where the soil ran deep and the fields caught what little rain the sky was willing to give. That is where you settle when your whole mind is on corn and beans and squash and the ordinary work of staying alive. You put your home where the farming is. And these were serious farmers. They cut check dams across the small drainages to slow the runoff and hold the dirt. They built reservoirs up on the high ground to bank water against the dry months. They farmed those mesa tops generation after generation in the light, on the good land, for something close to 700 years. This was not a marginal foothold. It was a homeland, worked and understood down to the last gully. Then, late in the 1200s, they did something that on its face makes no sense at all. They came down off the mesa tops. Not far, just down and into the alcoves worn into the cliff faces below the rim, the great shadowed hollows in the sandstone, and there they built whole villages. Stone rooms stacked against the curving back walls of caves, round towers, plazas tucked under overhangs 100 feet above the canyon floor and 100 feet below the ground they used to farm. In the end, there was something like 600 of these cliff dwellings packed into the canyons of Mesa Verde alone, from single-family nooks to the enormous ones we still walk through today. The largest we call Cliff Palace, about 150 rooms. 23 of the round, sunken ceremonial chambers we call kivas. Somewhere near 100 people living inside it, in one continuous sweep of fine masonry, pushed back into a natural recess in the rock. It is the biggest cliff dwelling anywhere in North America, and the first honest question to ask about it is not how beautiful it is. It is how much it cost to live there, not to build, to live there every ordinary day. Because sit with what that move actually meant. On the mesa top, your field was at your door and your water was a short walk. In the alcove, everything came to you the hard way. Every drop of water hauled up or lowered down a sheer rock face. Every basket of corn, every armload of firewood, every pot, every child too small to climb. All of it moving up and down the cliff on holes no deeper than the width of a few fingers, cut into the stone day after day, in the heat and in the ice for as long as the village stood. No one pays a price like that for scenery. You do not carry your grandmother into a cave you can only reach by rock climbing because you admire the canyon at sunset. A cost that steep buys exactly one thing, and it is not comfort, it is safety. You are purchasing a wall that cannot be rushed. And the second that word is on the table, safety, it drags a colder one behind it. Safety from whom? Take the mainstream answer first, because it is a good one and it is mostly right. The trees tell it. Every summer, a tree in this dry country lays down a growth ring, wide in a wet year, thin and starved in a drought. And the timbers these people cut and built with are still here, still in the walls, a running record of the weather stretched back more than 1,000 years. An astronomer named Andrew Douglas worked out how to read that record in this very region early in the last century, matching ring to ring from living trees back into the ancient beams. And once you can read it, the sky stops being a mystery. Read it across these canyons and you find two savage stretches of drought. One severe dry spell around the years 1130 to 1180, and then, later and worse, a long, grinding failure of the rains near the end of the century, roughly the years 1276 to 1299, so relentless that the people who first measured it simply named it the Great Drought. Corn does not bargain. These were farmers living right at the edge of what the land could yield, and when the rain fails year upon year, the thin margin that feeds everyone is the first thing to go. Fields that had carried families since the time of their great-grandparents stopped carrying anyone. Reservoirs went to cracked mud. So the standard reading says the people left because the land could no longer feed them. And on the question of the leaving, that reading holds up. The drought is real. The tree ring dates are exact. The hunger was real, and it was terrible. But watch what that explanation quietly steps around. Drought tells you why a farmer finally walks away from a dead field. It does not tell you why, before he walks, he first drags his entire family and everything they own into a fortress. If the only thing bearing down on you is a sky that will not rain, you do not spend your last strong years quarrying and hauling stone into a cliff to build a place that is punishing to live in and easy to defend. Thirst pushes you toward water, out into the open, where the springs are. It does not, on its own, push you into a stone alcove with a single narrow way in and a drop at your back. The drought explains the exit. It cannot explain the fear that came before the exit. And here the sequence is the whole story. They fortified first, then they fled. Something was frightening these people while their fields were still alive. Go back to the buildings, holding that in mind, and they stop reading as homes and start reading as decisions. Villages folded back into alcoves you can only enter in single file. Towers set where the sightlines run straight down the canyons, watching the approaches. Blank walls with no opening at ground level, the whole place entered from above, by ladders you haul up behind you. Doorways built low and tight, so a stranger has to come through bent double and one at a time. Communities pulling off good open farmland into positions that are wretched to supply and simple to hold against a crowd. Every one of those is the choice of people who expect to be attacked and who have decided the extra brutal hours on the cliff face each day are a fair trade if it means no one can take them in their sleep. That is not the architecture of a golden age settling gently into dusk. It is the architecture of people who keep watching the trail. And then there is the ground itself, which is where this leaves the realm of interpretation and lands in the realm of fact. At a place called Castle Rock Pueblo, and at another nearby called Sand Canyon Pueblo, archaeologists led by Kristen Kuckelman excavated the physical evidence of what happened when the fear turned out to be justified. Their work was published in the journal American Antiquity in the year 2002, and it is not vague. What they found was killing, not a cemetery, not the ordinary dead of a settlement laid to rest by their families, but violence on the scale of a massacre. People who died together, all at once, out in the village, and who were never buried by their own kin, because their own kin were no longer there to do it. The dating points to around the year 1280, the same window as the retreat into the cliffs, the same window as the final drought closing its hand. I want to slow down and be careful here, because these are not objects. These are the bodies of the ancestors of people who are alive right now, and the Pueblo nations who descend from them have said plainly that this evidence should be met as the human catastrophe it was, and not turned into a spectacle or a certainty for outsiders to reconstruct however they please. What the violence meant is genuinely open. The excavators lean toward one account, a society fracturing under scarcity, neighbor turning on neighbor. Many of the descendants ask that the disturbance of their dead be recognized as its own harm, and that our confidence be brought way down, that we not flatten their grandmothers into a diagram in a report. Both of those are true at the same time, and they can be held at the same time. The killing is written in the ground. The meaning we drape over it is ours, and it should be worn lightly. What no one disputes is that this was a country tightening, hard, into competition, family set against family, over water and corn and seed grain, that were all running short in the same handful of years, and that some of that competition ended in blood spilled on stone. That is the exact place where the postcard tears. These cliff dwellings get photographed in warm evening light and sold as a lost paradise, a serene high people who somehow melted off the face of the earth. That is not what they were. They were defensive positions, raised by frightened and stubborn and resourceful people in the worst decades their world had ever handed them. Beautiful, yes. The stonework is superb, the joins tight, the towers true. But it is the beauty of what a people builds when the only thing on the other side of the wall is the knife. So they held on for a while, up in those alcoves, behind those pulled up ladders, hauling their water hand over hand up the rock. They held on. 2 generations, maybe 3. And then they made the other decision, the larger one, and they made it together. The trees tell this part too, because a building date is only a cut tree. And when the cutting stops, the building stops. Across Mesa Verde, the tree ring construction dates climb right up toward the year 1300, and then they simply end. No new beams, no new rooms. And it was not only here, across the whole Four Corners country, the entire northern San Juan, the same thing happened inside the same few decades. The cliff villages, the most defensible homes these people had ever made, stood finished and lived in for less than 100 years, and then stood empty. Built, occupied, and left, the whole cliff chapter inside a single century. Some of us have lived longer than those villages were ever home to anyone. Now, the guidebooks of the last century had a tidy word for what came next. They wrote that these people vanished, that the cliff cities were abandoned by a race that thinned away into the desert and was never heard from again. And that word, vanished, is the most wrong word in this entire story, because we know precisely where they went. They went south and east, down out of the cold high country toward the Rio Grande, into what is now New Mexico and Arizona, to river valleys where the water did not fail. The same direction the Chaco people had already gone, toward the same rivers, for the same reason. They walked to the water and they lived. And here is the proof that shuts the case. The same proof this whole film keeps turning up. The descendants are not a hypothesis. They are the Pueblo peoples living today. The Hopi out on their mesas in Arizona. The Zuni, Acoma, the Sky City, lived in without a break for close to 1,000 years. The many pueblos of New Mexico strung along the Rio Grande and its side canyons. Their own histories have always said, without wavering, that Mesa Verde and Chaco were the houses of their ancestors, that the migrations were real, that the people moved and suffered and rebuilt themselves further south. For the better part of a century, outsiders filed that testimony under folklore. It was never folklore. The genetics now confirm an unbroken line of descent running from these cliff builders straight through to the living Pueblo nations. The very same continuity you have already watched the DNA lay out, exactly what the descendants had been telling anyone who would listen the entire time. So set the picture right side up. The cliff dwellings are not a monument to a golden age that ended in mystery. They are the last hard chapter of one specific people under one specific and crushing weight, drought stacked on drought, and the fear of their own neighbors laid over both. A people who fortified the high rock, who endured in it for 2 or 3 generations, who watched first their fields and then their safety run out, and who then chose deliberately, as a whole community, to leave a dying land rather than stay in it and die. Leaving was not surrender. Leaving was the plan. It was the hardest and the shrewdest thing they ever did, and it worked. That is the measure of the whole thing. Their great-great-grandchildren are farming and dancing and raising children and speaking their own languages in New Mexico and Arizona in this present year. The old books said these people vanished. The men and women living in those pueblos right now are the standing proof the old books were wrong. What Mesa Verde really records is not an ending. It is a people getting out in time. Keep that whole picture in your mind for a moment. and then turn the other way. Because everything the Southwest has shown us so far sits in the same kind of country. Deserts and canyons and high dry mesas, people spread thin across a hard land, always moving with the water, so that even now, even knowing full well they endured, you can almost feel how an outsider once talked himself into believing they had just faded out into the sand. Spread that thin across that much emptiness. A fading story is at least easy to picture, even when it is a lie. Now hold on to that and go east. All the way east, down off the dry plateau and across the whole middle of the continent to the thick, wet, black bottomland where the Mississippi runs wide and slow. And go back in time while you travel, back to the very years when Chaco was first rising out in the desert. Because at that same moment, on the bank of that river, someone was not laying out a scatter of farming hamlets at all. Someone was building a city. And at the height of it, that city on the Mississippi held more people inside it than the city of London, across the river. On the eastern bank, opposite modern St. Louis, in the flat floodplain later known as the American Bottom, there is a hill that is not a hill. It climbs about 100 feet out of ground that has no business producing hills. And the first thing to understand about it is that none of it is an accident of geology. Every part of it was carried there and put in place on purpose. People today call it Monk's Mound, after a small group of Trappist monks who kept gardens on its lower terraces centuries after the builders were gone. That name tells you nothing except who showed up late. The monks did not raise it. No one from Europe raised it. In its main form, it was finished by about the year 1100, and it remains the largest earthen structure anywhere in the Americas, north of Mexico, the largest thing of its kind on the whole continent outside the great cities to the south. Stand at its foot and try to take in the base. It runs about 955 feet along one side and about 775 along the other, a footprint so wide you cannot see the far corners from the near ones. Inside that footprint sits something on the order of 22 million cubic feet of packed earth. And here is the part that should stop you. There was no wheel doing any of the work, no cart, no ox, no horse, no draft animal of any kind on this continent to lean into a load. That entire mountain of soil arrived on human backs. People dug it from borrow pits scattered around the site, packed it into woven carriers, slung it over a shoulder, and walked it up the growing slope, tipped it, pressed it down with their feet, and turned around and went back for more. Then they did it again, and their children did it, and their children after them, across 4 or 5 generations. We know it was engineered because the engineers left their reasoning inside it. When excavators cut into Monk's Mound, they did not find a random dump of dirt. They found deliberate alternating layers, bands of heavy clay set against bands of sandy soil, chosen and placed to manage water and to keep the whole mass from slumping. Different soils were selected for different jobs, hauled from different sources, and laid in a sequence that a modern soils engineer can read and respect. This is not a pile. It is a designed structure built out of the only material the valley offered in unlimited supply, and built by people who understood how that material behaves under its own weight and under rain. And Monk's Mound is one mound. Around it, spread across roughly 6 square miles, once stood about 120 more. Some were flat-topped platforms that held buildings. Some were rounded and held the dead. Roughly 80 of them still survive today, after 2 centuries of plowing and paving and highway building did their work on the rest. They were not scattered at random either. They were arranged, organized around open ceremonial ground, including a central grand plaza that covered something like 50 acres of leveled, maintained public space. Someone laid all of this out. Someone held the plan in mind and made thousands of other people believe in it, enough to spend their lives carrying earth. Now, the number that reorders everything, at its height, in roughly the years 1050 to 1200, the core of this place held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people living together in one settlement. Count the farming communities packed into the surrounding bottomland, the districts that fed and supplied the center, and some estimates for the whole built-up region run as high as 40,000. Sit with that against what you were taught. We were told that north of the Rio Grande, there were no cities, only villages and camps, only people moving lightly across an empty land waiting to be discovered. And here, on the Mississippi, in the very years Chaco Canyon was rising out in the desert, there was a planned city of tens of thousands. By that higher estimate, the comparison gets genuinely hard to absorb. At 40,000 people, this city on the Mississippi may have rivaled and possibly exceeded London and Paris of the same century. I want to be careful and honest about that word, may. The population figures are reconstructions, built from house counts and site density and educated inference, and reasonable archaeologists argue the numbers up and down. The London comparison is a defensible claim at the high end, not a settled fact, and you should hold it exactly that loosely. But even the cautious version is staggering, because here is something that is not in dispute. No city inside what would eventually become the United States would surpass the size of this place until Philadelphia in the 1780s. From its peak on the Mississippi to Philadelphia, roughly 7 centuries pass before any American city is that large again. That gap is real. Whatever you make of the London question, the emptiness after this city is the fact that should keep you up. So the older textbook story, the one that framed pre-contact North America as a thinly populated wilderness of small wandering groups, is not slightly off here. It is describing a continent that did not exist. You cannot fit a city of this size into that picture. And the more the ground gives up, the worse the fit gets. Because this city was not something that slowly, accidentally grew. That is the reflex assumption, that a village got big, then bigger, then sprawled into a town over the centuries, the way an old European city thickens around a river crossing. The archaeology says something else. Around the year 1050, there is a break in the record, a sudden and deliberate reordering that researchers have taken to calling the Big Bang. In the span of a generation, older scattered villages on the site were leveled or built over, and a new plan was imposed on top of them. A city grid, 3 linked precincts organized in relation to one another. The Grand Plaza cut and leveled as one enormous act of public works. This is not organic sprawl. This is a decision executed fast by people with authority and a design. Somebody drew a capital and then made it. And near the western edge of the plan, they raised something stranger than any of the mounds. Circles of tall timber posts, great red cedar trunks set upright in the ground in a ring, and then rebuilt again and again in successive versions across time. Researchers gave it a nickname borrowed from an English monument and called it Woodhenge. I want to flag clearly what is fact and what is reading here. The posts are real, the post holes are in the ground, measured and mapped. What the posts were for is interpretation. The leading reading is that the ring functioned as a solar calendar, that from a viewing post at the center, certain outer posts marked the points on the horizon where the sun rose at the solstices and at the equinoxes, and that the whole device let the city track the turning of the year and time its ceremonies and its planting to it. That interpretation fits the geometry well. It is not signed and dated by the builders. Take it as the best current explanation, offered honestly as an explanation, not as a certainty. But even the cautious version leaves you with a planned city, a designed capital, laid out with astronomical care, on the exact continent the school books called an unbroken wilderness. Hold that, because now the ground turns dark. Among the mounds is one that archaeologists label Mound 72. It is not large. It does not look like much from the outside. Inside it, excavators found one of the most extraordinary and most disturbing set of burials on the continent. At its center lay a principal burial resting on a bed of marine shell beads, tens of thousands of them, disc beads carried from the distant coast, arranged beneath and around the body in the outline of a great bird. The count of those beads has never been pinned down exactly. Estimates run from roughly 10,000 to 20,000, and specialists still argue the figure. What is not in doubt is the labor and the reach it represents. Shell hauled hundreds of miles inland and laid out in a deliberate image with a body inside it. For decades, this burial was told one way and one way only. The story went that here lay a single powerful man, a warrior king, a falcon lord, laid to rest on the wings of a bird of prey, a hero. That story traveled. It got into books, into documentaries, into the popular image of the whole city. And in the year 2016, it was substantially corrected. A reanalysis led by the archaeologist Thomas Emerson and colleagues, published in the journal American Antiquity, went back to the actual skeletal remains with modern methods, and the falcon warrior did not survive contact with the evidence. The central burial is not one man. It is a pair, a male and a female, laid together. And with the sex of the principal individuals reconsidered, the whole meaning of the bird and the beads shifted. Emerson and his colleagues read the arrangement not as a monument to a conquering hero, but as a statement about creation, about renewal, about fertility, the joining of male and female at the symbolic heart of the city. If you have carried the falcon warrior image in your head, and many people have, set it down. It was a good story. It was also wrong, and the people who study this place are the ones who corrected it. Now, the harder part, and I am going to be careful with it, because these were real human beings, and their descendants are alive today. Around that central pair, the same mound holds mass graves. In one pit lay the bodies of 53 young women, most of them between roughly 15 and 30 years old, arranged in two neat layers. In another lay 39 people who had met violent deaths, some of them, from the evidence in the bones, not yet dead when they went into the ground. Across the whole of Mound 72, excavators counted on the order of 272 individuals, buried not all at once, but across about 6 separate episodes spread over roughly a century. The leading interpretation of these mass graves is human sacrifice, that these deaths were part of the ceremonies that built and rededicated this place. I want to state that plainly, and then hold it at the right distance. It is the leading reading of the evidence. It is not a filmed confession. It is a conclusion drawn from the way the bodies were placed, the condition of the remains, and the pattern of repetition, and serious researchers hold it as the best current explanation. These were the ancestors of people who are living now, and whatever was done in that mound was done inside a world of belief we are reconstructing from the outside, from bones and beads and post holes, not one we can question. What the evidence will not let us do is pretend the graves are not there. This was a city with power concentrated enough and a cosmology serious enough that human life was spent in its rituals. That is part of what a city on this scale meant here. It sits alongside the engineering, not in place of it. So put the whole thing together as it stood around the year 1200, a planned capital of tens of thousands. The largest earthwork on the continent, a calendar of cedar posts reading the sun off the horizon, trade lines pulling shell from the Gulf and copper from the Great Lakes into one center, ceremonies solemn enough to cost lives. This was not a village that got lucky. This was a state, or something close enough to a state, that the word fits better than any other. And within about a century and a half, it was almost completely empty. By about the year 1350, the city on the Mississippi was all but abandoned. The great plaza sat quiet. The houses came down or rotted. The mounds stood there holding their dead with no living city around them. And this happened a full century and a half before any European reached the interior of the continent to see it happen. Nobody in Europe emptied this place. Whatever occurred entirely within the indigenous world. And the newcomers who eventually walked past the mounds had no idea a city had ever stood there at all. Here is where the old textbook did the thing that should make you angry by now, because it is the same move it pulled out in the desert at Chaco. It looked at the empty city, wrote the word mystery in the margin, and moved on. The great civilization that vanished. Case closed, question waved away, the emptiness treated as an ending that explained itself. And it explains nothing. The honest answer is that we do not have one agreed cause, and I would rather give you the honest tangle than a tidy lie. Several pressures were real and are documented. There was climate stress, shifts in rainfall, and a drying trend that would have strained the corn agriculture the whole city depended on. There was flooding, the Mississippi being what it is, with evidence of major flood events pressing on the floodplain communities. There was the sheer weight of the city on its own surroundings, the demand for wood for construction and fuel across generations, and the resource depletion that so many people in one place inevitably produce. There was political strain, the possibility that whatever held tens of thousands of people under one plan simply came apart, that the authority frayed and the reason to stay dissolved. And this was not only a local event. Across a broad stretch of the mid-continent, region after region emptied out in roughly the same era. A large-scale reorganization that the archaeologist Stephen Williams named the vacant quarter. But watch what has happened to the tidy versions of even those causes. Because the evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with a simple story. For a long time, the flood collapse and the ecological ruin narratives were told with real confidence, the city drowning or exhausting itself and crashing. Then, in the year 2020, a study using fecal stanals, chemical traces left in the lake sediments by the human population itself, was used to track how many people were actually present in the American bottom over time. That kind of record is hard to argue with, because it measures the population directly rather than through burned houses or floodlines. And it did not show a sudden crash. It weakened the neat catastrophe stories and pointed instead toward a more gradual thing, a long leaving, people moving out over time rather than a city dying in a season. The collapse, the dramatic fall, keeps thinning out under examination. What is left looks less like a disaster and more like a decision taken by many people over many years to go. And that word go is the whole point, because it forces the question the textbook never asked. If the people left, then the people went somewhere. They did not evaporate off the face of the earth. A population of tens of thousands does not simply cease to exist. They walked out of the city carrying their language, their clans, their stories, their ways of farming and building and burying, and they carried all of it into somewhere and into someone. This is the part the word mystery was covering up. The people of this city were the heart of what archaeologists call the Mississippian world, a whole civilization of mound building, corn farming, town-dwelling societies that stretched across the mid-continent and the southeast. That world did not end at the year 1350. It came apart and it recombined. It dispersed and reorganized into the nations that Europeans would later meet across the same landscape and into the nations that are living on that landscape right now. The line from the city runs into many peoples, and it runs with particular strength in both the archaeology and in the people's own oral traditions, into the Degihan-Siouan-speaking nations. The Osage, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Quapaw, the Cow. Their histories, told in their own accounts and increasingly confirmed by the material record, reach back toward this Mississippi center and the world it belonged to. I want to frame that connection precisely because precision here is a form of respect. This city does not belong to any single modern nation. It was a center that many peoples flowed out of, and the descendant relationships are broad and shared. But the connection is real. It is not vague, and it is being honored in practice. Today, the Osage Nation is a primary partner in the stewardship and interpretation of the site, working with the archaeologists, speaking to a place their ancestors are tied to. These are not people telling stories about strangers. They are describing where they come from, and the science keeps agreeing with them. So look at what the word mystery actually hid. The largest city in the ancient Americas north of Mexico was said to have vanished. It did no such thing. It went into exactly the same place the people of Chaco went, into the ancestry of nations who are alive today, who kept the memory and who were standing right there the whole time. The city did not disappear into thin air. It disappeared into people, into families, into a continuing world, and the only thing that actually vanished was the willingness of the newcomers to ask the descendants where the city had gone. Nobody asked them. For generations, nobody thought the people telling the true story were worth listening to. That is now twice. Twice we have watched the same shape. A great society, engineered on a scale the schoolbook swore was impossible here. Then an empty ruin, labeled a riddle and set aside. And then, standing in plain view the entire time, the living descendants who could have told us what happened, ignored. In the desert and on the river, the pattern is identical, and the erasure runs the same direction each time, taking the achievement out of the ancestors' hands and taking the ending out of the descendants' mouths. But there is one civilization, out to the west, where the erasure went further than ignoring the people who remembered. There, it reached into the descendants' own language and took something out of it. It took a word those people use for their own dead, and it hung that word on their ancestors like a name. To understand how that happened and why it is the coldest thing in this whole story, go to the Sonoran Desert, to a people who cut hundreds of miles of canal straight through sun, baked hardpan, using nothing but stone tools, and carried water across the desert to make it bloom, and whose name, in nearly every textbook ever printed, is not a name at all. It is that word for the dead. So follow the water. Long before there was a city called Phoenix, before anyone in Europe had heard of this river or drawn it on a map, the people living along the Salt and the Gila were already moving water across the Sonoran Desert on a scale that has no equal anywhere in the ancient Americas north of Peru. That is not my flourish. That is the assessment of the National Park Service. And once you have stood over what these people cut into the ground, the phrasing feels almost modest. Begin with a number and let it sit. On the order of 500 miles of irrigation canals, hand-dug through desert hardpan, in the two river valleys where more than 4.5 million people now live. 500 miles. Not laid out on soft floodplain mud, but driven through a caliche subsoil so hard that modern crews break it with machinery and still complain. The main channels were not modest ditches. The largest ran up to about 50 feet across, at the top and 10 feet deep, wide enough and deep enough to carry a river's worth of water for tens of miles out to fields that had no business being green. And they were dug with stone hoes, wooden digging sticks, and baskets carried on the backs of people, with no draft animals, no metal, no wheel to help. To grasp what that demands, forget the excavation for a moment and think about the survey. Water does not run uphill, and it will not run at all if your channel drops too fast, because then it scours itself to pieces, or too slow, because then the silt settles and chokes it. These builders held a gradient of roughly a foot or two of fall per mile across tens of miles of open desert by eye, with cord and stakes, and a level sense that we have not fully reconstructed. Miss it by a hair over that distance, and the whole system fails. Here is the part that ought to stop a person cold. When engineers laid out the modern canal grid that waters Greater Phoenix, they did not everywhere start from scratch. In places, they followed the ancient alignments, because the ancient alignments were correct. The people who chose where the water should go read the slope of that valley so well that a 20th century American city with transit levels and steam shovels and hydraulic tables in stretches simply reopened the routes and let the water run where it had run 1,000 years before. You can drive across the Salt River Valley today and cross water that is obeying a decision made by a surveyor whose name we will never know, working with a knotted cord well over 1,000 years ago. The desert did not defeat these people. They read it. And the reading started early. This was not one grand project ordered by one ruler in one lifetime. The canal building begins well over 1,000 years ago and grows in stages across many generations. Small systems joined into larger ones, branch lines added, head gates rebuilt after every flood. The whole network expanded and repaired and expanded again. Nobody drew a master plan on a single day. What you are looking at is the accumulated intelligence of a society that stayed in one place long enough to learn its river completely and then to argue with it and win over and over for centuries. That alone should tell you something about the word the textbooks would later hang on them. Sit with the word for now. We will come back to it, and it will not read the way you expect. Move downstream in time to the stretch archaeologists call the Classic period, roughly the years 1150 to 1450. Near the modern town of Coolidge, on the flat between the rivers, one structure from that era is still standing, and people have been staring at it in confusion for a very long time. The Spanish who came through in the year 1694 gave it the name it still carries: Casa Grande, the Great House. It is a 4-story block of earthen concrete, 11 rooms in its footprint, and it was raised by piling up caliche mixed with water into massive walls, course by course, until the whole mass reached the height it stands at now. The material alone comes to something on the order of 3,000 tons, put in place by hand around the year 1350. It is one of the largest structures surviving from ancient North America, and it has no obvious military use, no clear residence for a king, no burial, nothing that answers the plain question of why anyone would spend that much labor on it. There is one class of feature in the upper walls that keeps drawing people back. High in the great house, above the level where anyone lived or worked, there are openings placed in the thick caliche. Certain of them line up at certain moments with events in the sky. Light falls through one at the setting of the sun near the longest days. Another opening catches a point in the wandering of the moon, the far northern swing that the moon reaches only once in about every 19 years, then abandons, then slowly returns too. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets oversold. The Park Service that manages the site says plainly that the purpose of the building remains uncertain, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the alignments themselves are measurable, and a 19-year lunar cycle is not something you stumble into by accident when you cut a hole in a wall. Whoever placed those openings had been watching the sky for far longer than one lifetime, keeping count across generations, because you cannot even notice a 19-year rhythm inside a single human span without records and without people who take the counting seriously. The interpretation is contested. The attention it implies is not. Now widen the frame past the river, because the desert was never the closed-off place the old story wants it to be. Across these valleys, archaeologists have mapped on the order of 250 oval courts, sunken earthen playing fields with raised banks along the sides. They are the northern reach of a game. The ball game ran through the whole of ancient Mexico for thousands of years, played with a heavy rubber ball on courts built for the purpose, and its playing fields march northward, valley by valley, until they arrive here, at the edge of the Sonoran Desert, farther north than the game had ever been known to reach. That is not a small detail dropped in for color. It means these farmers were not sealed off in their own valley, perfecting their own canals in isolation. They were the top edge of a connected world that ran south for 1,000 miles, sharing a game, and with the game very likely sharing goods, ideas, and belief. I want to be honest about the sequence, because it is easy to blur it into one golden age, and that would be false. The ball courts belong mostly to the earlier centuries. They flourished for a long stretch, and then by around the year 1100, they largely fell out of use. They were not replaced by nothing. In the Classic period that follows, the great public works become something else. Broad platform mounds, raised up as stages for whatever the community did in common, and it is in that later phase that the great house at Casa Grande stands. So do not picture crowds at the ball courts and a 19-year moon watched from the great house in the same afternoon. One world of public architecture gave way to another. What matters is that across both, this was a society organizing thousands of people around shared undertakings. First the courts and the game, then the mounds and the great houses. And underneath all of it, without pause, the canals. Which brings us to their name. And this is where I have to slow all the way down, because the name is the whole reason this valley belongs in this film. In every textbook, in every museum panel, in nearly everything written about these canal builders, they are called the Hohokam. If you have ever read about them, that is the word you read. It was not their word for themselves. We do not know what they called themselves. This name was fixed on them in the 1930s by an archaeologist who took it from the language of the people already living in the valley, and then it hardened into the scientific label the whole world now uses. Look at where he took it from. The word comes from the Hohokam language, from Hohokam, and the way it has been printed for decades is as those who are gone, or all used up, all finished, a people used up and vanished from the land. That is the gloss you will find in the older references, and you can feel what it does. It turns the canal builders into a cautionary tale, a culture that exhausted its desert and its own strength and emptied itself out of history, leaving only ditches behind, all used up. Read it that way, and the 500 miles of canal become a kind of headstone, except that reading is a mistranslation and not a subtle one. In the Hohokam language, Hohokam does not mean a used-up civilization that failed. It refers to the ancestors, those who have passed on, those who have gone before. It is a word a living people use for their own beloved dead, the ones who came earlier and are honored and remembered, the way any of us speak of the grandparents and the great-grandparents we carry with us. The scholars who study Hohokam are clear that all used up is a flattening, a known oversimplification of something far more tender and far more human. It is not a verdict on a failed society. It is the ordinary, aching word a people keeps for the ones it has buried. Now hold the two meanings side by side and feel the size of the mistake. A living people looked at the great canals in their valley and had a word for the people who built them. The word meant our ancestors, the ones who came before us, our dead, and the science that arrived to study the canals took that word of remembrance, mistranslated it into all used up, all gone, vanished, and stamped it on the ruins as a diagnosis. We took a people's word for their grandparents and printed it in our textbooks as a label for a mystery that emptied out and disappeared. The erasure in this whole story does not hide in some archive. It is sitting in plain sight on the spine of every book about these people, in the name itself. They did not vanish. Somebody read the word for the dead and mistook it for the death of a nation. I said we would return to the word, and there it is. But finish the history honestly, because something real did happen to the Canal Society, and pretending nothing changed would be its own kind of dishonesty. Around the year 1450, again well before any European reached these valleys, the great integrated canal system came apart. Not the people, the system. The vast cooperative machine that moved water across 500 miles broke down, and the population reorganized into something smaller and more dispersed. Why is genuinely unsettled, and I would rather give you the real argument than a tidy cause. The rivers themselves are part of it. The Salt and the Gila swing between violence and drought, and the archaeological record shows a punishing sequence, great floods that tore out headgates and ripped channels apart, followed by droughts that left the ditches dry, one after another, faster than a society can rebuild. There is a second, older explanation, that the desert farming itself poisoned the ground, that centuries of irrigation left salt and waterlogging in the soil until the fields would no longer yield. I have to flag that one as contested. It sounds intuitive, but a study published in the year 2023 questions how much salinization really drove the collapse. And the honest position today is that we do not know how large a factor it was. And underneath the floods and the soil, there is a truth that has nothing to do with weather at all. A canal network that large is not a thing. It is an agreement. 500 miles of channel only carries water as long as thousands of people up and down the system keep showing up to clear the silt, mend the banks, rebuild the headgates after every flood, and share the flow fairly in a drought when every field is desperate. The moment that cooperation frays, when the upstream and the downstream stop trusting each other, when the labor stops arriving, the water stops moving, whether the river is generous that year or not, a drought can break the crops. Only a breakdown between people can break the canals. So the collapse, when it came, was very likely as much a story about the limits of holding a huge society together as it was about rainfall. That is not a failure of engineering. It is the hardest problem any large society ever faces, and it did not make anyone disappear, because they did not disappear. This is the point the mistranslated name buries, and it is the point the descendants have been making all along. The people who watched Spanish missionaries ride into these valleys in the 1600s, the people farming the salt and the Gila when the United States drew its borders around them, the people living in that same desert this morning, are the Akimel O'odam, the river people, and the Tohono O'odam, the desert people. They are here. They never left the valley. Their farms sit beside the same rivers, and in some places their fields are watered by the same lines their ancestors cut. Their oral tradition carries the older people forward, not as a vanished mystery, but as family, as the ones who came before. And that is exactly what their words said the whole time. Hohokam, the ancestors. Turn the word back to its real meaning, and the so-called riddle of the vanished Hohokam simply dissolves. The ones who are gone are the dead who came before, honored and remembered by their children, and their children are still farming beside the canals. There was never a disappearance to explain. There was a people mourning and remembering their own, in their own language, and outsiders who could not read the grief in the word decided it must be the epitaph of a lost race. We found a people's love for their dead, and we filed it in the reference books as an unsolved case. Step back now and count what we have seen. 4 times, in 4 corners of this continent, the same shape has appeared. A people who built at a scale that should have made them impossible to forget. A collapse or a reorganization that outsiders read as an ending. And descendants standing right there the whole time saying, those were our ancestors. We are still here. Every one of these stories sits inside the last 1,000 years, maybe the last 1,500, and that timing is precisely what makes them so easy to dismiss. Late, you can tell yourself. Local. A scatter of brief flare-ups on a continent that was otherwise empty and waiting. File them that way, and the old story survives. Except the central idea of this whole investigation, the plain fact of people in North America moving earth by the ton to raise monuments, does not begin 1,000 years ago in a river valley in Arizona. It does not begin with these canals, or with a city on the Mississippi, or with any farming society at all. It begins more than 5,000 years ago. Before there was a pharaoh, before the first stone of the first pyramid was set at Giza, people on this continent were already piling up monumental earthworks. And they did it with no farming to feed a labor force, no city to house one, and no king to command one. That single fact, that the monument building here is older than Egypt and was done by people who supposedly had none of the things monuments are said to require, is the last assumption holding the vanishing story together. And it is about to come apart. Start with the date, because the date is where the neat old story stops holding weight. In the northern part of Louisiana, up above a small stream on a low rise of ground, stand 11 mounds of piled earth, joined one to the next by low ridges that curve around into a rough oval close to 900 feet across. The place carries the plain name Watson Brake. For most of the last century, nobody looked at it and thought much of anything. It sat on private land, half swallowed by trees, and the few people who noticed it assumed it was recent, the kind of thing thrown up a few centuries back. Then, the ground underneath it was actually dated. The samples came back at roughly 5,400 years ago, and a lot of very confident sentences about who lived on this continent and when and what they were capable of quietly stopped being true. Let me put that number where you can feel it. 5,400 years ago means these mounds were already standing, already finished, before the first stone of the Great Pyramid of Giza was set. They are older than Stonehenge. They are older than the writing systems we usually treat as the opening scene of civilization. And they are older by nearly 2,000 years than the other great site we are going to walk through in a moment, the one most people who know this region have at least heard of. Watson Brake predates it by roughly the span that separates us from the Roman Empire. This is not the beginning of the monument story in North America. This is a chapter that was already ancient when most of the famous chapters began. I want to be fair about why nobody expected this, because the disbelief was not stupidity. It came from a rule that had worked almost everywhere else. The rule went like this: big earthen monuments require a lot of coordinated labor. A lot of coordinated labor requires a large population that stays in one place. Staying in one place requires farming, because farming is what produces the food surplus that lets people live shoulder to shoulder year after year. And a farming society dense enough to build usually has someone at the top telling everyone else where to dig. Settled fields, stored surplus, a chain of command. That was the recipe. Monuments were understood as the receipt you got at the end of it. So when a date like Watson Brake first surfaced, the honest reaction from serious people was that the date had to be wrong. That reaction is worth respecting, because it is how the process is supposed to work. You do not throw out a rule that has explained 1,000 sites because one site looks strange. You check the strange site again. And that is exactly what happened here. The team went back into the mounds, took more samples, dated different materials from different layers, and worked to rule out the obvious traps: old wood, contamination, charcoal that had washed in from somewhere else. The age held. It held under exactly the scrutiny that was designed to break it. This is the part I always want the audience at home to sit with. The mainstream did not bury this. The mainstream tested it, lost the argument to its own evidence, and updated. That is not a scandal. That is the system doing the one thing we always claim to want it to do. So now look at who actually built the place, because this is where the old recipe falls apart completely. Watson Brake was not raised by farmers. There were no fields here, no maize, no domesticated crops holding a large population in place through the seasons. The people who carried the earth for these 11 mounds were foragers. They fished the streams and the backwaters. They gathered wild plants. They hunted, and they moved with the food the way people had done in this valley for thousands of years already. They had no permanent city. And here's the piece that genuinely dismantled the old assumption. They show no sign of a ruling class. No palace, no elite burials stuffed with wealth while everyone else got nothing, no evidence of one group commanding the labor of the rest. Think about what that combination was supposed to be, according to the rule. Impossible. The whole logic said you could not get monument-scale construction out of mobile fishers and foragers with no boss and no granary. The labor simply would not organize itself. Except at Watson Brake, it plainly did. 11 mounds in a connecting oval do not build themselves out of thin air. Somebody planned the layout. Somebody decided across many human lifetimes to keep coming back to the same ground and keep adding to it. The earth was hauled in loads, moved by hand, shaped and shaped again over something like 5 centuries. 500 years of a project with no king to enforce it. The mounds are the argument, and the argument won. I said the mainstream corrected itself, and I mean that literally, not as a figure of speech. For a long stretch of the 20th century, the textbook position was that this kind of thing did not happen in the pre-farming Americas, because it could not. Watson Brake, once the dates were confirmed, forced the discipline to rewrite that position in print. It is now one of the standard examples archaeologists reach for when they teach that monumental building does not actually require agriculture or hierarchy, that people who lived by hunting and fishing and gathering were fully capable of long-term, large-scale, coordinated construction. That is a reversal. And It matters for this whole film because notice what had to be assumed for the old rule to feel obvious in the first place. You had to quietly assume that the people already living here were not the kind who built things. The evidence in the ground says they were, and had been, for a very long time. Which brings the deeper problem into focus, and it is a problem about attention rather than about dirt. If the tradition of moving earth to make monuments was already 5,400 years old at Watson Break, then every later site in this valley is not a first attempt. It is an inheritance. These builders were standing on top of a practice that ran back further than most of the civilizations we consider foundational. And yet, the story that got written down about North America, the one repeated for generations, treated this continent as a kind of waiting room, empty, historyless, a wilderness that nothing important had happened in until much later arrivals showed up to make it matter. Watson Break is a very old, very physical refusal of that idea. It was here. It was organized. It was ancient. Somebody just decided not to see it. Now let me take you downriver in time, to the site that is better known and even harder to explain away. About 3,400 years ago, in this same lower Mississippi world, people raised Poverty Point. In the year 2014, it was named a World Heritage Site, the first in Louisiana to earn that listing, which puts it in the same formal company as the pyramids and the great cathedrals. Stand at the center, and you are looking at 6 enormous ridges of earth, set as concentric arcs, nested one inside the next, curving around a broad open plaza like ripples frozen in the ground. From above, the pattern is deliberate and precise. This was not a heap. It was a design, laid out at a scale that takes real effort even to survey, let alone to build. And then there is the mound. On the western edge of the site rises a single great mass of earth that people call the bird mound, because seen from the air, its shape has been read as a bird with outstretched wings. It stands about 72 feet tall. Its base spreads more than 700 feet across. The volume of fill inside it comes to roughly 8.4 million cubic feet of earth, which makes it the second largest earthen mound by volume in the entire eastern half of the continent. Every bit of that was soil gathered somewhere, carried to this one point, and piled up by human beings working with their own bodies. No machines, no animals harnessed to drag loads, no metal tools to move the ground faster. Just people and time and an intention held steady across a very large group. Except, and this is the detail that genuinely stops me, it may not have taken very much time at all. When archaeologists examined the layers inside the bird mound, they expected what you usually find in a structure that big, distinct bands showing it was built up in stages across generations, old surfaces where grass grew and rain fell before the next load was added. That is the normal signature of a monument that took centuries. They did not find it. The fill shows no weathered pauses of that kind running through it. The evidence points to the whole mass going up in one sustained push, probably in under 3 months. A structure of that size, the second largest of its kind on this side of the continent, raised in under 90 days by people with no draft animals and no metal, working with baskets and their own backs. Sit with the logistics of that for a second, because the speed is the thing that should rearrange your sense of these builders. To pile 8.4 million cubic feet of earth in a single season, you need an enormous number of hands, and you need them fed and organized and pointed at the same plan, all at once and then released. That is not the pace of a slow ceremonial habit. That is a mobilization. It implies that a very large number of people came together on purpose, coordinated their labor to a common design, completed a monument most societies would have spread across lifetimes, and did it fast. And once again, these were not farmers. The people of Poverty Point lived by fishing the rivers and the swamps, by hunting, by gathering the wild abundance of the valley. The old recipe said, this population should not have existed at this scale, doing this work at this speed. The mound says the recipe was missing something. Let me be honest about where interpretation enters, because I do not want to sell you certainty that the ground has not earned. The under 90 days figure is a reading of the layers, and readings can be argued. Whether the shape was truly meant as a bird is an interpretation too, and reasonable people differ on it. What is not in dispute is the volume, the height, the concentric ridges, the age, and the fact that the builders were not an agricultural state with a labor army to command. Even the most cautious version of Poverty Point, the version that hedges every soft claim, still describes fishers and foragers organizing construction on a scale the old rule flatly said was beyond them. The conservative reading and the dramatic reading arrive at the same uncomfortable place. The people, we were told, could not do this, did this. And here, the site opens up into something even larger than its own earthworks, because Poverty Point was not just a place people built, it was a place things came to. When you sort through what was actually excavated there, the materials do not come from the neighborhood, they come from all over. Stone and raw material arrive from hundreds of miles away in nearly every direction, and the specific origins can be traced because different stones carry different geological fingerprints. This is not guesswork. You can match a piece of stone to the region it was quarried from the way you might match a signature. And when the matching is done, the map it draws is enormous. Look at what shows up in the ground. There is novaculite, a hard, fine stone good for tools, brought from the Ouachita Mountains and the Ozarks to the west. There is soapstone, soft enough to carve into vessels that could sit in a fire, hauled all the way from the Appalachians to the east. There is galena, the heavy, bright ore of lead, traced north to sources in Missouri and Iowa. And there is copper, worked native copper, carried from the Great Lakes region and possibly from the southern Appalachians as well. Put those origins on a map and draw the lines back to Poverty Point, and you are looking at material converging on one point in Louisiana from the mountains of the west, the highlands of the east, the upper Mississippi, and the Great Lakes. More than 3,000 years ago, raw material was already crossing half a continent to reach this single hub. I want to be precise about what that does and does not prove, because it is easy to overreach here, and I would rather you trust the restraint. It does not prove a single empire stretching from the lakes to the Gulf. The material could have moved hand to hand, community to community, along chains of exchange, without anyone walking the whole distance. But even the modest version is staggering. For soapstone from the Appalachians and copper from around the Great Lakes and novaculite from the Ozarks to all end up in the same plaza, there had to be relationships, roots people knew. An understanding held across hundreds of miles and many different communities that this place was worth sending things to, that is a network, not a metaphor for one, an actual working web of connections spanning much of what is now the eastern and central part of the continent, running at a time when, by the old story, almost nothing was supposed to be happening here at all. So let me say plainly what these two sites, taken together, do to the story. This whole film is built to question. We were told in a dozen different regional versions that peoples in ancient North America appeared, briefly flourished, and then vanished, leaving mysteries and empty ground behind. That sentence only sounds reasonable if you start from a certain assumption that the continent itself was a blank, a place without deep history, where anything remarkable must have been brief and fragile and easily lost. Watson Brake and Poverty Point take that assumption and break it in the most concrete way possible, with millions of cubic feet of deliberately shaped earth. Before Egypt had finished its pyramids, people here were raising monuments. Before the classical world got going, foragers on the Mississippi were running trade lines across half a continent. Once you know that, the old sentence reads differently. Appeared, flourished, vanished. Notice that not one of those words survives contact with the evidence. They did not appear, they had been here, building, for thousands of years. They did not merely flourish in some brief window. They sustained a monumental tradition across a span longer than most recorded histories. And vanished is a word that belongs to the people who could not see them, not to the people themselves, whose descendants were still here, still telling the story straight, long after the outsiders decided the land was empty. That sentence appeared and flourished and vanished was never a description of what happened on this continent. It was a description of how little the people writing it were willing to look. And the piece of it that will not let me go is the network, because the network is the thread that ties this whole documentary together. If soapstone from the eastern mountains and copper from the north and stone from the western ranges were already converging on one point in Louisiana more than 3,000 years ago, then the sites we keep treating as isolated riddles were never truly isolated. They were connected. They were nodes, each one a knot in a much larger web of movement and exchange and shared knowledge running across the continent. The mystery was never a scatter of unrelated ruins. It was one system, and we kept examining it one lonely piece at a time. Follow that thread far enough, past the mountains of raw material and the fast-raised mounds into the forests of Ohio, and it leads to the largest and strangest node of all. There, laid out along a ridge in earth, coils a serpent, a third of a mile long, and after more than a century of study, we still cannot agree on when it was made. Go out to Adams County in southern Ohio and walk to the tail. The ground lifts under the grass in a low bank, no higher than your knee in most places, and it bends, and then it bends the other way, and when you follow it with your eyes, it simply keeps going. 1,348 feet of shaped earth, uncoiling along the spine of a ridge in the unmistakable form of a snake. There is nothing else quite like it on the planet. It is the largest serpent effigy known anywhere in the world, and it was lying here in the woods long before any surveyor thought to run a tape along its length. You cannot really take it in from the ground. That is the first thing that ought to bother you. Stand beside it and you see a grassy embankment. Pleasant enough, easy to miss. It only becomes a serpent from above, from the air, from a vantage the people who built it could not physically occupy. They laid down a figure 1/4 of a mile and more in length, with a curl in its tail and a great open jaw at its head, and they got the proportions right across ground they could never see whole. That is not decoration. That is engineering carried out to a plan held entirely in the mind. Now look at where the head points. The jaws of the serpent open around a hollow oval of earth, and the long axis of that oval, the line running out through the open mouth, lands on the point where the sun goes down at the summer solstice. The longest day of the year. Follow the body back the other way, into the tight coils of the tail, and the alignments there answer to the sunrises of the cold half of the year, including the winter solstice, the shortest day. So the two ends of the animal mark the two turning points of the sun. The moment it reaches its farthest north and the moment it reaches its farthest south. Sit with what that means. Someone took the plainest and most reliable clock the sky offers, the swing of the sunset back and forth along the horizon across a full year, and they wrote it into the anatomy of a snake at the scale of a hillside. The head keeps the summer. The tail keeps the winter. This is a calendar, and its dial is a landscape. You do not build that by accident, and you do not build it in an afternoon. You build it because you have watched the horizon for years, generations maybe, and you have decided the knowledge is worth setting into the earth in a form that will outlast every person who understood it. And here is where the trouble starts. Because for all of that precision, for all of that intent, we cannot tell you when it was made. Not roughly, not within 1,000 years. The single most studied earthwork of its kind in North America, and the field genuinely does not agree on its age. I want to be careful here, because this is not a case of one side hiding something from the other. It is an honest scientific argument, still open, between people who have spent their careers on this ground. For most of the 20th century, the answer seemed settled. The serpent sits beside burial mounds that belong to the Adena people. And the Adena flourished from around 300 BC onward. Nearby graves, same ridge, same culture, so the effigy got filed alongside them. The serpent was Adena, better than 2,000 years old, and that was that. It is a reasonable inference. When you find a monument sitting next to datable burials of a known people, assigning it to that people is exactly what a careful archaeologist ought to do first. Then, in the 1990s, a team went looking for material they could actually date. Robert Fletcher, Terry Cameron, Bradley Lepper, and their colleagues pulled charcoal out of the body of the serpent itself, out of the constructed soil, and ran it through radiocarbon. The numbers did not come back at 300 BC. They came back at roughly the year 1070, not the Adena at all. That date belongs to the Fort Ancient people, who lived in the valley more than 1,000 years after the Adena. Overnight, the serpent had a new set of parents, and a story you could hang on it, a snake image echoing beliefs the Fort Ancient are known to have held, built perhaps in the same century as a bright new star in the sky that the whole hemisphere would have seen. That should have closed the book. It did not. In the year 2014, another study went back over the whole question: the samples, the soil, the way the earlier charcoal related to the original construction rather than to some later repair. Its reading pushed the date back down again, back toward the Adena era, back towards something in the range of 300 BC. And Bradley Lepper, who had helped produce the later date, pushed back in public, in print, defending the medieval age and questioning the reworking. The argument is still going. I am not going to stand here and tell you it has been resolved, because it has not been. Serious researchers looking at the same mound come away separated by 1,000 years. Think about how strange a position that leaves us in. We can tell you that the builders tracked the solstices with real accuracy. We can tell you they commanded a workforce and a design across a quarter mile of uneven ground. We can describe the thing down to the centimeter. And we cannot answer the simplest question a child would ask, which is, how old is it? The same figure of Earth is claimed today by two different peoples whose lives never overlapped, the Adena and the Fort Ancient. And the honest state of the science is that the case remains open. I find that far more interesting than a tidy label would have been. It means the serpent is not finished telling us things. But if you only look at the serpent, you will misread the whole situation. You will treat it as a marvel standing alone in the Ohio woods, a one-off, a curiosity. It is not alone. It is the most photogenic piece of something enormous. And to see the size of that something, you have to lift your eyes off the snake and look at the world it belonged to. Step back then from the ridge and go to the people who ran that world. The Hopewell. That is a name modern scholars gave to a way of life that filled the Ohio Valley roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago. And I use it the way archaeologists do, as a label for a culture, not for a single tribe. What the Hopewell left behind is a landscape of geometric earthworks so precise that early observers refused to believe local peoples had made them. Circles, squares, octagons, some of them enclosing enough ground to lose a small town inside, laid out with a consistency of measurement that repeats from one site to the next across the region. These were gathering places, places built to bring people together from a very long way off. And to understand how far off, you dig into the mounds and you look at what they buried in them. Because the Hopewell did not fill their most sacred deposits with local river stone and local clay, they filled them with the far edges of the continent. Start with the glass. In the Ohio mounds, archaeologists keep pulling out obsidian, volcanic glass, worked into blades and enormous ceremonial points. Obsidian does not occur in Ohio. It comes from lava. And the nearest lava that matches the chemistry of this material is out west, in the country around Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountains, roughly 2,000 miles away. And this is not a stray flake or two that could have passed hand to hand by accident. At one site alone, the obsidian is measured in hundreds of pounds. Someone moved a mountain of Wyoming glass, most of the way across North America, on foot and by canoe, to be shaped and then buried in Ohio. You can test that claim, by the way. That is what makes it strong. Volcanic glass carries a chemical fingerprint, the exact trace element signature of the flow it cooled from, and geologists can match a blade in an Ohio mound to a specific source region out in the northern Rockies. So this is not a guess about vague long-distance contact. It is a measured line drawn from a grave in the Ohio Valley to a cliff face near Yellowstone, and the line holds up in the laboratory. Now add the rest. because the glass is only one thread. There is copper in these mounds, hammered into ornaments and breastplates, and the copper traces back to the shores of Lake Superior to the north. There is mica, sheets of it, thin and reflective, carried up from the southern Appalachians, and in one of the most quietly astonishing objects ever recovered from the ground, a piece of that mica was cut into the clean and deliberate outline of a human hand. There are teeth from sharks, and there are the shells of sea creatures, and those came from salt water, from the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic, hundreds of miles south and east of any place a Hopewell craftsman ever stood. Lay it all on one table. Glass from the Rockies, copper from the upper Great Lakes, mica from the mountains of the southeast, shark teeth and marine shell from 2 different coastlines. Every one of those materials had to travel a distance that we would find daunting today with roads and engines, and every one of them ended its journey in the same handful of earthworks in southern Ohio. This is the point I need you to hold on to. The Ohio Valley was not a backwater at the end of the world. It was a center. Things flowed toward it from the mountains and from both seas. There is a phrase specialists use for this, the Hopewell interaction sphere, and it is a dry piece of language for something that ought to stop you cold. It means a web of exchange and shared ideas that reached from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic, from Lake Superior to the Gulf of Mexico. Not an empire. Nobody is claiming a single ruler sat in Ohio and commanded all of that. Something subtler and in some ways more impressive. A network held together by relationships, by pilgrimage, by trade, by shared belief, stitched across the better part of a continent, by people the school books of my childhood described as scattered and isolated. That word, isolated, is the one I keep tripping over, because it is precisely backward. The peoples the old textbooks pictured as cut off, sitting apart in the woods with no reach and no connections, turn out to have been the destination. They sat at the meeting point of trade routes that crossed thousands of miles of mountain, forest, river, and coast. When you find Yellowstone glass and Gulf shell in the same Ohio grave, you are not looking at isolation. You are looking at the endpoint of a system that spanned the continent, and the burden of proof shifts hard onto anyone who wants to keep calling these builders simple. And notice what the network does to the serpent. The effigy stops looking like a lonely oddity the moment you set it inside this world. The same region that pulled in glass and copper and shell from 1,000 miles in every direction is the region that could marshal the labor and the sky knowledge to write a calendar into a 1/4 mile of earth. The monument and the trade are 2 faces of the same organized, far-reaching, deeply capable society. The reason the serpent looks impossible in isolation is that it never was in isolation. Nothing here was. So the sites the film has been walking you through were never a set of separate riddles, each waiting for its own separate explanation. The great earthen figure in the Ohio hills, the geometric enclosures, the imported glass and copper and shell, the calendar in the snake, these are not unrelated wonders that happen to sit on the same continent. They are parts of one thing. A continent laced together by peoples who built on a monumental scale and traded on a monumental scale, and who had been doing both in one form or another for a very long time before any of the events we have been dating. Which brings us, at last, to the present day, and to a moment that arrived only very recently. In the year 2023, the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks were named a World Heritage Site. That is the same global list that carries the pyramids of Egypt and the Acropolis of Athens and the Great Wall. An international body looked at these earthworks in Ohio and formally ranked them among the achievements of humankind worth protecting for everyone, forever. Sit with the timing of that, 2023, not the 19th century, when settlers were already standing on these mounds. Not 100 years ago, 2 or 3 years back from where we are now. For 2 centuries, these earthworks were treated as obstacles. They were plowed flat to plant corn. They were leveled for towns and cut through for roads and quarried for fill. People built their houses on top of the very structures the world has now decided rank with the wonders of antiquity. The recognition is real and it is deserved, and it is also, if you let yourself feel it, a little bit shameful. Because it took us this long to say out loud what was sitting in plain sight the whole time. And that lateness is the thread I want to pull, because it is not really about a slow committee. It points at something older and more deliberate. Understand what we have actually established. From at least 3,000 years ago, this continent was home to societies that raised monuments you can still climb, and that moved rare materials across mountains and coastlines in a coordinated exchange reaching from the Rockies to the sea. In their organization, in their astronomy, in the sheer distance their networks covered, they stand comparison with anything going on in the ancient world across the ocean. This was not a fringe. This was a civilization of builders, plural, working on a continental stage. The evidence for it was never hidden. That is what I cannot get past. The mounds are enormous. You could stand on them. Farmers plowed around them and through them for generations. The obsidian is heavy, physical, sitting in museum drawers, a piece of the Rocky Mountains you can pick up and hold in your open hand. The copper, the mica hand, the seashell, all of it was in the ground, waiting. The entire time. None of it had to be discovered in some remote cave. It was underfoot in the most farmed and settled part of the eastern woodlands. So how, with all of that lying in the open, did the story ever come out the way it did? Because for most of the last 2 centuries, the tale that got told was not a tale of Adena and Hopewell and 4 ancient people building calendars and running a continental trade. It was a tale of a vanished race. A lost and mysterious people, noble, gifted, gone, who raised these wonders and then supposedly disappeared without descendants, leaving the mounds to be found by others. That was the popular explanation. A race that vanished. Mound builders who were anybody at all, except the ancestors of the people still living right there when the settlers arrived. Now stand those 2 things side by side. On one side, mounds you can climb and glass you can weigh and a trade network you can map from source to grave. On the other, a fantasy about a vanished people who left no children. One of those is evidence. The other is a story, and a false one. And it did not grow up in the absence of proof. The proof was everywhere. So the false story had to come from somewhere else, and it had to be doing some kind of work. Because nobody invents a vanished race to explain monuments whose builders never left. That is the question the whole of this film has been walking toward, and we can finally put it plainly. The mystery was never a hole in the record. The mounds were here, the obsidian was here, the descendants were here, and they said consistently that their own ancestors had built these things. The mystery of the mound builders was not something the evidence forced on anyone. It was manufactured, on purpose, against the evidence. It was an invention, and an invention gets made for a reason, by someone who needed it to be believed, and that reason, when you finally see it whole, is the darkest thing in all of these 4 hours. So here is the lie, said as plainly as it deserves to be said. For most of the 19th century, educated America did not believe that native people had raised the mounds. It believed the reverse. It believed that the great earthenworks spread across the heart of the continent, the terrace platforms, the long geometric enclosures, the effigies shaped like birds and serpents, had been built by someone else entirely, a people who came before, a people who were gone. And the one group that was never permitted into the story was the group actually living beside the mounds when the first surveyors arrived. This was not a rumor traded in taverns. This was the settled view. It filled best-selling books. It was recited from lecture platforms to full halls. It was taught to children and printed in the periodicals a respectable family kept on the parlor table. The mounds, the consensus held, were the wreckage of a lost race. And because no one could point to that race, the very absence became proof of how ancient and how tragic the whole affair must have been. Who this lost race was supposed to be shifted with the fashion of the decade. And the sheer variety is worth sitting with, because it tells you the answer was chosen first and the evidence assembled afterward. Some writers made them a lost white civilization, refined and doomed. Some made them the lost tribes of Israel, wandered impossibly far from home. Some made them seafarers out of the old world, Phoenicians, Welshmen, stray sailors blown off the edge of the known map. Some traced them to a sunken Atlantis. Some brought them north out of ancient Mexico, a splinter of the Toltec sent wandering. Notice what every single version shares. Anyone at all could have built the mounds. Anyone except the people who were standing right there. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to treat this as the quaint error of a less informed age, and it was not merely an error. It was useful. And to see how useful, you have to ask what a story like this actually does once it is loose in a country that wants something. Follow the logic the way its own believers followed it. If a noble lost race had built these monuments, and if that race had then been overrun and exterminated, then someone had to have done the exterminating. And the story supplied the culprit close at hand. The ancestors of today's native nations in this telling were not the builders at all. They were the destroyers, latecomers, conquerors who had swept in, wiped out a gentler and greater civilization, and squatted in its ruins without the wit to understand what they had broken. Sit with what that does to a claim on land. Once you have cast native peoples as invaders who took the country by slaughter, you have quietly rewritten the moral ledger. Now, the newcomer with the survey chain and the deed is not seizing anything. He is restoring order. He is avenging a lost people who cannot speak for themselves. Taking the land stops being a theft in that telling and becomes a kind of recovery, an inheritance collected on behalf of the ghosts. The dispossession dresses itself as justice. And here the timing stops being a curiosity and starts to matter. The lost race myth did not drift along at some even hum through the century. It swelled to its widest popularity in the 1830s. Those are the same years the federal government was pressing Indian removal, the years of the Indian Removal Act of the year 1830, the years the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole were being forced from their homelands in the southeast and marched west, often over the very earthworks their own ancestors had built. I want to state this connection exactly, because it can be overstated, and I will not overstate it. Historians who have studied this myth do not claim it invented Indian removal, and neither will I. Removal had many engines, land hunger, cotton, gold, raw political will. But those same historians make the link firmly, and it is documented, not guessed. The vanished builder's story gave the removal a flattering costume. It handed ordinary people a reason to feel, not guilt, but a grim sense of setting an old wrong right. A comfortable public needs a comfortable reason, and the myth supplied one. It helped justify the taking. That is the claim, made carefully, and it is enough. Now, you might assume that no one could have known better at the time, that the truth simply lay beyond the reach of the era, waiting on microscopes and radiocarbon and everything we have since built. That assumption is wrong, and the proof is almost uncomfortably early. Go back to the early 1780s. On the Rivanna River, not far from his own house in Virginia, a man had a burial mound opened. The man was Thomas Jefferson. And what he did with it separates him from every treasure hunter who ever put a shovel into one of these hills. He did not tunnel in from the top to snatch whatever was buried deepest, which was the fashion, and which destroys the one thing that matters. He cut a vertical trench straight down through the mound so that he could stand inside the cut and read it like a wall. Understand why that single decision was so far ahead of its moment. A mound is not a random pile. It is built in episodes, layer over layer, one act of burial and covering laid across the last, so that the depth is a record of time. By slicing down through it, Jefferson could see the stratification, the bones lying at different levels, some jumbled, some laid out, the earth between them. He was reading the sequence. That method, letting the layers testify in order, would not become standard practice in archaeology for roughly another 100 years. It is the reason he is sometimes called the father of American archaeology. and for once, the title is earned rather than decorative. And his conclusion, drawn from the evidence in front of him, and not from any theory he wished were true, was correct. He judged that the mound held the dead of the region's own native people, gathered and reburied over generations. He was writing about the ancestors of the Monacan, and he noted something that ought to have ended the entire debate before it began. Native people still came to the place. Descendants of the builders still visited their dead. The living answer to the question was walking to the mound and standing over it, while the learned world insisted the builders had vanished from the earth. So let me be plain about what this means for the century that followed. The right answer was available from the very start. It was reachable with a shovel, a careful eye, and a willingness to believe what was in the ground, rather than what a reader wanted to feel. Jefferson reached it in the 1780s. And the myth of the lost race did not merely survive that. It grew larger, louder, and more popular for decades afterward. A false story does not outrun a true one because the evidence is missing. It outruns it because the false story is doing a job the true one cannot do. That is the hard center of all of this, and I do not want to soften it. The vanishing was not always an honest confusion. For a crucial stretch of American history, it was a manufactured belief, kept alive because a nation acquiring a continent found it convenient to believe the previous owners had never really been owners at all. But manufactured stories can be taken apart, and this one finally was, by the very kind of institution that might have been expected to protect it. Move forward now to the year 1894. The Smithsonian, through its Bureau of Ethnology, publishes a document with a dull and enormous title, The Report on the Mound, Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. Its principal author is a scientist named Cyrus Thomas. And what makes this report the tombstone of the myth is where Thomas started. He did not begin as a skeptic of the lost race. He began, by his own account, more or less believing in it, expecting the fieldwork to confirm a separate mound-building people. This was not a man setting out to prove a point. This was a man who followed the evidence until it turned him around. And the fieldwork was vast. Thomas and his team surveyed and excavated across an enormous span of the country, working through thousands of mounds, mapping them, sectioning them, cataloging what came out of them and how it was made. Then he did the thing the myth had never been forced to endure. He tested it against the ground, systematically, claim by claim. He took each pillar of the lost race theory and knocked it down in turn. The supposed metalwork that no native people could have managed, the forged and misread inscriptions that were meant to prove old world visitors, the insistence that the earthworks were simply beyond the capacity of the region's native nations. He examined the construction, the tools, the pottery, the burial customs, and he traced the continuities forward into peoples who were still very much present. The report concluded, on the weight of all of it, exactly what Jefferson had concluded a century before, and exactly what the descendant nations had been saying the entire time. The mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native Americans. There was no lost race. There had never been one. I want you to hold both halves of that result, because the triumph and the tragedy live in the same sentence. By the year 1894, the vanished race was scientifically dead, dismantled in an official report by the country's premier institution of learning. And it did not matter to the outcome that mattered most, because the myth had already finished its work. The removals were decades done. The land was already taken. The story had served its purpose and could now be quietly retired, its job complete, its bill paid by people who never got to argue their own case. So let me do the thing this whole film has been building toward. Let me run every act of it back through this lens, now that we can see what the lens is. Think again about Chaco Canyon, those great houses in the high desert, the engineered roads, the astronomy built into stone. We were told for a long time to wonder where its people went, as if the canyon had simply been abandoned by a people who evaporated. They did not evaporate. They moved, as the Pueblo peoples always said their ancestors moved, and the descendants have been telling us their own migration histories for as long as anyone cared to listen. And in our own time, the ancient bodies themselves have spoken. Genetic evidence has tied the people of Chaco directly to living Pueblo communities. Ancestor to descendant, read out of the bones. The connection the descendants asserted was confirmed in the body. Mesa Verde is the same story with the same ending. The cliff dwellings emptied, and the emptiness was sold to the public as a disappearance. It was not a disappearance. It was a departure, remembered and accounted for by the same living Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the peoples of the Rio Grande, whose forebears walked out of those alcoves and built new lives that never stopped. The people were only ever hard to find if you refused to look at the ones standing in front of you. Turn to Cahokia, the vast city on the Mississippi with its enormous central platform, the largest earthen construction in the Americas north of Mexico. Here, the lost race myth had perhaps its grandest prize, a metropolis so ambitious that a comfortable public could scarcely imagine native hands raising it. But the threads run straight into the living world. Cahokia connects to the Osage and to the wider Degihan-Suan world, peoples whose own traditions carry the memory of that river country and its sacred order. The builders of the greatest mound on the continent were not a riddle. They were somebody's grandparents. And then the Hohokam of the southern deserts, the people of the canals, hundreds of miles of engineered channels that pulled a living out of the driest ground and that still shape where water runs in that country today. Their descendants are the Odam, who never left the land those canals watered. And here the myth left a fingerprint so blunt it is almost hard to believe it went unnoticed. The very word Hohokam, the label pinned onto the culture and repeated in every textbook as the name of a mystery, is an Odam word. It refers to those who have gone before, the ancestors, the dead. The descendants literally handed over the name of their own forebears, and it was taken up and turned into a tag for a puzzle, as if the people who supplied the word were not the answer to the question. And the mound builders of the East, the makers of the serpent and the great geometric enclosures, the ones this whole reckoning began with, they were never lost at all. They were reassigned. Their achievement was lifted off of them and awarded to an imaginary race, precisely because their descendants were still there and still, inconveniently, wanted their country. Line them up, and the pattern is total. Chaco, Mesa Verde, Cahokia, the Hohokam, the mound builders of the East. Every last civilization this film has called vanished has living descendants who said so the whole time, who named their own ancestors, who kept the histories, who pointed at the ruins and told us plainly whose hands had built them. And every time, when the newest science was finally brought to bear, from Jefferson's careful trench to Cyrus Thomas's thousands of mounds, to the genome read out of the bones at Chaco, it did not overturn what the descendants said. It confirmed it. The experts, working honestly, keep arriving exactly where the descendant peoples had been standing all along. So we come to the real shape of the thing. And I want to land it without any softening, because after 4 hours, the honest conclusion has earned the right to be blunt. The great mystery of ancient North America was never where the civilizations went. That was the wrong question from the first day it was asked, and it was often asked in bad faith. The people did not go anywhere. Their descendants have not been telling us they were. The Pueblos are here. The Osage are here. The Odam are here. The Monacan are here. The nations of the mound country are here. They carried the memory across every year that the rest of the country insisted they were the wreckage of someone greater. The mystery that actually needs solving is the other one. Not what happened to them, but what happened to us. Why the rest of us needed them to be gone. And when you follow that question all the way down past the lost tribes and the drowned Atlantis and the wandering seafarers, you reach an answer with no romance left in it at all. A people who are said to have vanished cannot hold title to their land. That is what the vanishing was for. That is the work it did. The continent did not lose its civilizations. They were never lost. The story was the thing that went missing from the truth. And the people it tried to erase are still standing on the ground it tried to take from them. So come back to where this started. Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, standing in a canyon that should never have been built in at all. For a century and a half, that silence was the whole story. The lost people, the vanished farmers, the mystery with no ending. And then the science arrived, and it took the story apart, one piece at a time. Not a people without rulers, but a house that held the most sacred ground in the canyon through its mothers for the better part of 300 years. Not a gentle fade into the dusk, but a people who fortified the cliffs and then chose to walk to the water rather than die on the mesa. Not a scatter of farming hamlets, but a city on the Mississippi that may have rivaled London and then emptied into the ancestry of the Osage. Not a desert used up and abandoned, but 500 miles of canal, and a living people's word for their own dead that we misread as an epitaph. Not a late and lonely flare on an empty continent, but monuments older than the pyramids, and a network that carried volcanic glass from the Rocky Mountains into a grave in Ohio. And not a vanished race at all, but a story invented to take a continent and taken apart, at last, by the very institution that might once have kept it alive. Run the whole thing back, and one fact refuses to move. Every people we were told had vanished is still here. The Pueblos farm the country their ancestors farmed. The Osage stand with the river world their ancestors raised. The Odom water the same ground their ancestors watered. The descendants of the mound country never left the mound country. They carried the truth across every year. The rest of us called it a mystery. And when our newest science finally caught up, from a careful trench cut in the 1780s to a genome read out of the bones in our own decade, it did not correct them. It agreed with them. We handed these people an ending. They never needed one. The building stayed behind. The people did not. And for 150 years, we mistook the silence of empty ruins for the silence of empty peoples, while their descendants were living, the entire time, within a few days' walk of the places we called lost. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want a real answer, not a shrug. Across all of it, Chaco, Mesa Verde, Cahokia, the Hohokam, the mound builders of the East, which of these vanishings do you think was an honest failure to look, and which one was a story someone built on purpose because the truth was too inconvenient to own? Pick one. Tell me which piece of evidence decided it for you, and tell me the one you think the rest of us still have not faced. Because the canyon fell silent. The city emptied. The name became a word for the dead. But the people did not vanish. They are still standing on the ground the story tried to take from them. And we are only now, with the descendants finally in the room, learning how to listen. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the history the textbooks got wrong.